Mike Yeadon is a scientist, a former vice president within the global drug manufacturer Pfizer, and many other things besides. His CV is on LinkedIn there, you can read it if you want. He's as qualified as anyone to talk about respiratory diseases. And he recently made these mildly provocative comments on the James Delingpole podcast.
Medical, scientific, legal people, you must be able to see now and say that it's our professional view that SAGE is providing aberrant, seriously, lethally wrong advice. The people of this country and the scientists and professional bodies should demand their immediate ejection. Listeners, the reason the pandemic is not over is because SAGE says it's not. That's it. I've said such awful things about several named individuals. Hi Pat, he knows what I've said. Why hasn't he sued me? When you say in public something that I know you know is not true and you use it for a purpose, then I think the phrase lie is correct. I've accused him of lying. So why hasn't he sued me or put an injunction on me? He would lose. I would be able to show, I think, to any reasonable judge that what I have said is supported by our history and the science that we share, the medium of science. We can both read this stuff. What he said is not true. So he's either lying or he's incompetent. There is no innocent explanation for it, and yet he's not sued me, and I'm doing it again today. Come at me. I don't care at all.
Yeah.
So as I say, the reason it's not over is because SAGE says it's not.
Libelling someone on the record is a potentially costly business, which I think Mike Yeadon can do with pretty much complete equanimity for a couple of reasons. In the first place, he's right, so Vallance would lose. Fact, at the end of the day, is the ultimate vindicator. And also, Vallance has no possible reason to react. He's got the government in his pocket, and so by extension, the BBC, Sky News, ITV, major broadcasters. He has absolutely no reason to unnecessarily open such a can of worms. So what is the only man who the demented Prime Minister of the UK is listening to? What is he actually lying about? Vallance claims that the pandemic has barely begun, when in fact it's actually over. As well as in the podcast you heard a snippet from above, he also laid it out in this devastating article he wrote for Lockdown Skeptics. And although he focuses on what he calls 2 fatal errors, everything really boils down to what you heard him say there. Limited regional outbreaks will be self-limiting, and the pandemic is effectively over. And it all boils down to the very simple information he lays out diagrammatically here. That's probably a better look at it. I don't need the text there particularly, so just that will do. The chart on the left shows the SAGE suppositions, and on the right is Mike Yeadon's evidence-based reality. SAGE claims in excess of 90% of people are still susceptible. We know this, for one thing, because they said so a month ago. As over 90% of the population remains susceptible, not acting now to reduce cases will result in a very large epidemic with catastrophic consequences. And the remaining 7% infections also gels with another very famous measure of theirs, so I'll come back to that and move next door for now. Anyway, that's SAGE's pretty simple position. So, moving over there is a bit more to think about. 30% infected, how is that? This is actually so simple even I can work it out, you don't need to be a scientist. A few days ago, Jonathan Ioannidis, who is a world-leading epidemiologist, had this paper published on the WHO site about the infection fatality rate, which people seemed to be assuming was around the 0.2-0.3% region anyway. Across 51 locations, the median COVID-19 infection fatality rate was 0.27%, corrected 0.23%. We now know that the infection fatality rate is 0.23%, or 1 fatality for every 435 people infected. How do we get to 32% infected? Actually, we don't quite, because Mike used 0.2%, he rounded down a tad, which I won't do. So 1 death for every 435 infected, 43,000 or so deaths in total. So if you take that grim tally and times it by the number of infections you need for 1 death, you get total infections of 18.7 million people, which is 28% of the population. Mike's got 32% because I think he rounded down a bit, but it's not a consequential difference. You remember that 7% infections number from SAGE on the left there I said I'd come back to? You know where that comes from? Where do all roads SAGE come from, and where do all roads SAGE lead to? You already know the answer. Of course, Neil Ferguson, Report 9. Nothing matters to SAGE but Ferguson's bullshit modelling. As we know, Ferguson guesstimated an infection fatality rate of 0.9%, almost 1%. And if you adjust that sum with 0.9%, 4 times bigger than 0.23, you get not 28% but 4 times lower. The 7% you see on the left there, which we now know is much larger as per the yellow number on the right. But, how do we know that 32% can't be reinfected? Here we go. Of the 750 million people which the WHO recently estimated have been infected so far, almost no one has been reinfected. Some have, yes, but he also makes the point that many more have immune deficiency problems. The reality is there's no evidence for reinfection. So that's now about 30% taken care of. Now, prior immunity, 30% right down the bottom. Keeping it fairly brief, this comes down to immunity which is already existent in the population from our body's past experiences with the various coronaviruses which are already in circulation, which you absolutely never hear anything about from the BBC, and which in some cases cause the common cold. In terms of the specifics, he says, in short, multiple research groups across Europe and the US have shown that no less than 20% and no more than 80%, clustering around 30% of the population had robust responses of T cells in their blood to SARS-CoV-2 before the virus reached their countries. And in terms of the long-lasting nature of such, it has separately been shown that a group of people who had been infected by SARS around 2003 still had robust T-cell responses to that virus 17 years later. Magically, the same people who had recovered from SARS 17 years ago also possessed T-cell immunoreactivity against the novel virus, which their bodies had never seen. And he's got the references to all the various papers listed either in this article or his other one. So at this point we've got 32% of the already infected, which I'm downgrading to 28%, and around 30% prior immunity. That was the number between 20 and 80, but clustering around 30 as the various science groups suggested was the case. That gives total 58-60% or so to date, leaving just 40-ish% susceptible, so we are already comfortably into the herd immunity threshold at this point. Then the easy bit left is most children between ages 0 and 11. That is most, not all, because a small amount seem to act as transmitters. They don't get ill, but a small amount seem to transmit. So that's the remaining 10%, which takes the non-susceptible total of the population up to around 70% and just 30% or so susceptible to infection. Infection fatality rate 4 times lower than originally claimed by Ferguson, giving 4 times as many people already infected and, crucially, no evidence of reinfectability, plus prior immunity and a slice of very young children who aren't affected in any shape or form. That is a simplified version of his full breakdown, which is that, having taken into account the slightly lower infected segment, which I put at 28%, not 32%. But you can see it hardly makes any difference. That, in reality, is that. Everything apart from the red is immunity. So 68% of it, 2/3 of the population, 32% still susceptible, and I don't think there is any standard by which that would not be judged as essentially representing population immunity. This is Paddy Vallance's version. Look at the massive sea of red, almost everyone, and this is the evidence-based reality. Comforting to think that that is the reality and that is the fantasy. Unfortunately, the fantasy you're looking at there is the only thing the deranged incompetent in charge can see. He can only see what Vallance is telling him there. The reality is a complete unknown to him. The pandemic is over. The only circumstances in which that wouldn't be the case would be if what you'd seen above was false, in which case Vallance would be onto his lawyers with a libel suit, which he's not. Why isn't he? Because he knows that it's scientifically valid, in which case Vallance knows also that the pandemic is over. I cannot see any fault in the logic there. By the time you get to see this video, I will have uploaded an extended version of the video clip you saw at the beginning to my Twitter, and you will find a link in the pinned comment, i.e. the comment at the top of the comments. Please take the time to retweet it. If you haven't got a Twitter account, get one. Oh no, I only do Parley and Gab, I'm part of the resistance. Go away, go back to bed, you're part of the problem. You can actually make a difference by helping to spread this stuff. And if you feel inclined to pony up to my subscribe star, that also will be appreciated. So you have the fantasy, which is that, and the reality, which is that, or that, which is a graphically useful simplification, and it represents the approximate reality of current approximate herd immunity. Patrick Vallance, who controls Johnson, and so pretty much by extension the BBC, Sky News, ITV, is for the time being sticking with his fantasy land. For how long that is the case remains to be seen. And like I say, you can help by spreading the information.
The reason the pandemic is not over is because Sage says it's not. That's it. I've said such awful things about several named individuals. Hi Pat, he knows what I've said. Why hasn't he sued me? When you say in public something that I know you know is not true and you use it for a purpose, then I think the phrase lie is correct. I've accused him of lying. So why hasn't he sued me or put an injunction on me? He would lose.